She paid $40 she did not have for a man she had never met, and by the time the pharmacist had dropped the coins into the register, every arrangement she had quietly built over the course of 11 years had begun to come apart. Not loudly, not with the drama she might have deserved, just the soft sequential closing of doors she did not yet know were moving. His name came later. All names came later. What came first was a pharmacist in the Mapo district of Seoul, a Tuesday afternoon in late November, a fluorescent light that buzzed without apology above a queue of 4 people, and a woman named Chae Soyeon standing third in that line, already calculating whether the $40 in her coat pocket was meant for a prescription or for the bus fare she would need for the next 4 days. She had just sold her second car. She had recently moved from a 2-bedroom apartment to one that had only a curtained alcove where a second bedroom had been promised in the listing. She was not performing poverty. She was simply in it, quietly, the way certain people carry difficulty without announcing it, because announcement had never helped her and because there was no one particular person to announce it to. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She was behind an old man, 73 years old, small in the shoulders in the way men sometimes become small when the world has been pressing on them long enough, his jacket a dark green that had once been much darker, his hands loose at his sides. He had put his prescription on the counter, and then put his card on the counter, and the pharmacist, a young man who was not unkind, but who was under instruction, had shaken his head and said something quiet that Soyeon, even standing 2 people back, had heard clearly enough. The card had been declined. The man's name, she would learn only weeks later, was Oh Jung-jul. He was 73. He had been a night watchman for a logistics depot for 22 years before his knees made that impossible. He had 5 prescription medications. That afternoon, he had enough in his account to cover 2 of them. He did not argue. He did not perform embarrassment. He simply nodded at the pharmacist with a courtesy that Soyeon found, in the 2 seconds she observed it, more quietly devastating than any argument would have been. And he began to sort methodically through the small stack of boxes to determine which 2 he could take and which 3 he would leave. She did not think about it. That is the precise truth, and it is worth staying with that precision. She did not calculate. She did not construct a charitable narrative about herself or imagine herself observed. She had done almost none of the sentimental preparation that generosity is often preceded by in the stories people tell about it afterward. She simply stepped forward and said, in plain Korean, that she would cover it, and she put her $40 on the counter, and the pharmacist looked at her, and then looked at the old man, and then completed the transaction. Oh, Ung-chul turned to her. He said in 8 words, "You don't know who you've just helped." She thought he meant it as gratitude, an old man's slightly formal way of saying thank you, implying that his situation was more complicated than it appeared and that the help, therefore, meant more. She smiled. He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that was not quite gratitude and not quite appraisal, and was perhaps both. Then he gathered his medications and left. She did not follow him out. She filled her own prescription, which cost $37, which she put on a credit card that was 2 months from its limit, and she walked out into the November cold and thought about the bus schedule and did not think about the old man again for exactly 9 days. 9 days later, a man came to her workplace. Soyeon, at this point in her life, was 41 years old. She had worked for 7 years as a mid-level procurement coordinator for a mid-sized architectural supply firm called Hanguk Materi, a company that had never quite reached the size it had once imagined for itself, and that had consequently developed the particular interior atmosphere of organizations that have quietly given up on becoming something else. She was not unhappy there. She was not happy there. She was competent in the way that certain people are competent, quietly and thoroughly, without any particular interest in being seen being competent, because she had learned at some early point that visibility and reward did not connect as cleanly as institutions like to promise. The man who came to her workplace was young, 32 at most, she estimated. He was wearing a coat that cost more than her monthly salary, not because of its ostentation, but because of its perfect, total absence of ostentation. It was the kind of coat that had made all its decisions about quality so far in advance that it no longer needed to make any argument about itself. He asked the receptionist for Chai Soyeon by name, and he was shown to her desk. He sat down across from her without being invited. He said, "My grandfather asked me to return this." He put an envelope on her desk. It was thick. She looked at it and then looked at him and said nothing for a moment, because she recognized the quality of stillness in him as something that would not be rushed. She said, "I don't need it." Returned, he said, "He knows." A pause. "That's why he's returning it." She did not open the envelope in front of him. She said, "Who is your grandfather?" He said, "Oh, Jung-chul. He lives in the Mapo district. You covered his prescription 9 days ago." A slight correction offered and declined. She had counted 9, and the pharmacist's transaction date confirmed it. She noticed the precision. She noticed that he noticed her notice it. She said, "He didn't need to do this." The young man said, "He needed to do exactly this?" He stood. He was, she observed, not threatening in any of the ways she associated with threat. He was something else, controlled in a way that did not need to prove its control, present in a way that did not need her attention. He said he would also like to meet you if you're willing. Not urgently, when it suits you. He put a card on top of the envelope, plain white, a name and a number. The name on the card was Oh Ji-hoon. He left. She sat with the envelope for 40 minutes before she opened it. Inside was $4,000 in clean-counted notes and a handwritten letter on plain stationery in an old man's careful hand, 8 sentences long, which thanked her without excessive warmth and explained that the $4,000 was not repayment in the arithmetic sense, but was instead what he called a fair accounting of the kind of attention she had paid. Because attention, he wrote, has a worth that money usually fails to name, and yet money is sometimes the only naming instrument available, and so he was using it without apology. She read that letter 4 times. She did not call Oh Ji-hoon for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she paid down her credit card, restocked a kitchen she had been quietly rationing for 2 months, bought a winter coat for herself, the first new coat in 4 years, and sat for a long time with the feeling that something had shifted in the geometry of her life without her having moved. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, she called the number on the card. Ji-hoon answered on the second ring. He said, "I thought it would be closer to a month." She said, "I thought so too." He said, "My grandfather would like to have tea. Are Saturday afternoons free?" They had been most Saturdays for longer than she cared to arithmetize. Oh Ji-hoon at 32 was not something the newspapers had named yet, though they would name it eventually, in the oblique way. Seoul's business press names things it finds uncomfortable, calling it influence without locating its geography, calling it reach without specifying its direction. What he had built, beginning at the age of 24, starting with nothing except an absolute education in how power actually moved in a city, was not precisely a criminal organization in the cinematic sense. It was not a gang in any cartoonish formulation. It was instead a kind of structural service organization, operating 3 to 4 layers below where institutional power believed itself to sit, composed of 47 people in fixed roles, another 80 in variable capacities, handling the negotiation of conflicts that the law either could not reach or had chosen, for its own reasons, not to reach. Debt arrangements, territorial calibrations between competing businesses in gray market economies, the occasional retrieval of persons or objects that had been moved without consent, It ran through the outer edges of the Mapo, Yeongdongpo, and Goro districts and had quiet extensions in 4 other cities. It generated in its best recent year something on the order of $38 million in fee-based arrangements. It did not deal in narcotics. This was not a moral accident. Ji-hoon had made a decision. At 24, standing in a room where 2 older men had offered him a much faster path to much larger numbers, that the fastest path was also the path he had seen consume 11 people he had known by name, and he had declined it in language so plain and so without apology that the 2 older men had, after a long silence, respected it, because plainness in that context is its own kind of authority. He had built it all while maintaining in the formal record the identity of a real estate asset manager for a legitimate holding company that genuinely managed 19 properties across Seoul and Incheon, and that genuinely turned a profit. And he had built it for 8 of those years, with the invisible, absolute architecture of one person. Her name was Yoon Do-hee. Dewey had been 24 when she came to work for Ji-hoon, introduced through a chain of professional referrals that had started with a tax attorney and ended with a question from Ji-hoon across a table in a restaurant that no one reviewed on any public platform. He had asked her, that first meeting, what she believed the difference was between information that was true and information that was useful. She had said, without any particular theater, that truly useful information was information whose moment was correctly identified, because the same fact delivered early was speculation, delivered late was apology, and delivered in the correct moment was leverage. He had hired her on the conclusion of that sentence. What she did for him in the formal record was nothing. She was listed nowhere in the holding company's documents. She appeared in no organizational chart. She had no title. She had instead a set of functions that she had quietly expanded over 8 years from 1 to 11, each expansion coming not because she had asked for more, but because she had, without announcement, already been performing the function for long enough that the alternative, formalizing someone else in that role, would have been an active dismantling of something already operational. She tracked every relationship in the organization's network, all 47 fixed members and all 80 variable contacts, their pressures, their family situations, their financial vulnerabilities, the way their loyalties could shift and in which direction. She maintained the organizational memory because Ji-hoon trusted memory to no digital archive. She managed the communication sequencing when multiple operations required coordinated timing. She read every contract before Ji-hoon signed it, not for legality, that was an attorney's work, but for subtext, for the specific places where language had been made slightly imprecise in ways that would matter later. She had in 8 years identified 14 such imprecisions across 11 contracts, and in each case her early identification had prevented a loss that she had also pre-calculated. She had done all of this for a salary that, when set against its output, was not so much underpayment as it was a category error. The number itself, 4.5 million, won a month, was not nothing. But it was named for her administrative function in the holding company, the only layer at which she formally existed, and it did not attempt to account for the rest. Ji-hoon knew this. He knew it the way people know things they have decided not to calculate out loud, because calculation would oblige reckoning, and reckoning would cost something he was not, in the years she was most valuable to him, prepared to pay. He told himself it was the nature of the arrangement. He told himself she knew the nature of the arrangement. He told himself she had chosen it. And then, 8 years in, he met Chae So-yeon. He did not intend for So-yeon to become important to him. He had not intended much of anything in the personal register for a long time. What he had was a grandfather he visited every second Sunday, a discipline of not sleeping more than 6 hours, because more than 6 felt like surrender to something he couldn't name, a carefully maintained absence of anything resembling a public personal life, and a complete private personal life that could fit inside a single evening per week if he structured it correctly. But Soyeon did not fit inside a single evening. She did not fit inside any structure he applied. She had a way of sitting with silence that was not performative emptiness, but actual patience, a genuine willingness to let a moment be what it was before deciding what to do with it. She had, in the first tea with his grandfather, listened to the old man for 90 minutes about his 2 decades as a night watchman with a quality of attention Ji-hoon had not seen in anyone outside of his own operational context. Not polite listening, actual listening. The kind that recalled detail and asked the question that belonged to that specific detail, not the next question on a mental list. After the tea, walking out, Ji-hoon had said to her, "You do that professionally." She had said, "Do what?" He had said, "Pay attention." She had looked at him with something that was not flattery and not deflection and said, "I think everyone does it. I just haven't learned to do it selectively." He thought about that sentence for the next 6 days. They began meeting with a regularity that neither of them named for the first 4 months, because naming was a kind of institution and institutions implied commitment, and commitment implied a negotiation. Neither of them had opened yet. They met on Sunday afternoons when he visited his grandfather, and they met on occasional weekday evenings at a noodle restaurant in Hapjeong that had 17 seats and no reservation system, and that Soyeon had found on a walk 2 years earlier, and returned to whenever she needed the specific comfort of being in a place that had not tried to be anything other than what it was. Doohee knew about Soyeon by the 6th week. This was not surveillance in any sinister sense. It was the nature of Doohee's function that she tracked everything relevant to the organization's stability, and Ji-hoon's personal habits were relevant to the organization's stability, in the same way a building's foundation was relevant to its structural load. What she observed without particular feeling at first was a shift. Ji-hoon began arriving to their working sessions differently. Not distracted, something more precise than distraction. He was present in his operational capacities exactly as always, but there was a quality of divided attention in the spaces between operational content, the small silences, the slightly different way he sat that she recognized as the presence of someone new in his thinking. She identified Soyeon inside of 11 days through the standard documentary layers she maintained on everyone adjacent to the network. She read the result with the same flat, informational attention she brought to everything. Procurement coordinator, 41 years old. Recently, financially strained, no institutional affiliations that could compromise, no prior relationships that overlapped with the network. Clean, in every technical sense. She put the file away and did not revisit it. What she felt, if she allowed herself the word, was something she would have categorized not as jealousy, which was a loud and inaccurate word for it, but as a kind of recalibration. A quiet acknowledgement that a variable she had held it stable for 8 years had begun to move. What she did not do was tell Ji-hoon what she felt. What she did instead was exactly what she had always done. She continued to function, continued to build, continued to track and protect and expand, because the organization was not hers, but its health was her work, and she had never been able to separate her work from herself. 6 months after Ji-hoon and Soyeon began meeting, Doohee discovered something. It was not what she had been looking for, because she had not been looking for it. She had been auditing the communication records from a contract dispute in the Yeongdeung-po territory, a standard review, when she found an inconsistency that did not belong to the dispute, a routing, a small one. An amount of money, 11 million won, that had moved through a subsidiary account connected to the holding company toward a destination that the account's documentation did not acknowledge. She followed it with the same flat attention she brought to everything. Without alarm, the way a surgeon notes an anomaly, without startling themselves. The trail went through 4 layers. It took her 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, she had a name. The name was Park Hyun-soo. Park Hyun-soo was 44 years old. He had been with the organization for 9 years. 1 year more than Doohy, though he had arrived by a different route, a recommendation from a long-standing external partner in the Goro territory, and had built his role from the outside in, demonstrating loyalty through a series of increasingly load-bearing operations until he stood in the current structure as Ji-hoon's most trusted operational director. He managed 30 of the 47 fixed members directly. He had access to the organization's financial flow at a level that only Ji-hoon and Do-hee exceeded. He had, over 9 years, performed the role of trusted lieutenant so completely and with such apparent absence of private agenda that he had become one of the organization's true structural assumptions, a fixed point against which other things were measured. The routing Do-hee found was not the first. It was, she concluded, after a further 12 days of quiet investigation, conducted entirely outside any system Ha-Yoon-soo could observe. The 41st such transaction, the first appearing in records from 2 years and 4 months prior. 41 transactions. Total sum extracted, approximately 890 million won, pulled in amounts small enough individually to pass beneath any threshold anyone had thought to set, because no one had thought to set the threshold that low, because no one had imagined they would need to. She sat with this for a full day before allowing herself the secondary question, which was, where was the money going? The answer to that question, which took her another 8 days, was worse than the first. The money was not being spent. It was being concentrated. It was sitting in 3 accounts she tracked to a holding structure she had not previously identified. A new holding structure, parallel to the existing one, quietly capitalized to a level that would be operationally significant if it were ever activated. Ha-Yoon-soo was not stealing for consumption. He was building a competing infrastructure, slowly, with a patience that almost, but not quite, approximated her own. She built the evidence archive over the following 6 weeks. She was methodical. She produced across 43 documents a complete reconstruction of every transaction, its routing, its destination, its implication, cross-referenced against dates and events in the organization's operational record to show which externally observed events had been deliberately shaped to mask the financial movements. She identified 3 moments where Ha-Yoon-soo had used his operational authority to redirect organizational resources toward covering his own tracks. She identified 1 moment where he had recommended and Ji-hoon had accepted a restructuring of certain account oversight protocols that had, as a non-accidental consequence, removed one of the monitoring layers that might have caught the routing 3 years earlier. She then did something that was, even by her own standards, extraordinary. She did not take the archive to Ji-hoon. She had intended to. She had assembled it with the intention of delivering it to Ji-hoon directly, as she had delivered every other piece of operationally critical information in 8 years. But in the 3 days between completing the archive and the conversation she had planned with him, 2 things occurred. The first was minor. Ji-hoon canceled their working session on a Wednesday without explanation, rescheduled it, then was 22 minutes late and arrived still texting, which was not in itself significant, except that she had watched him be late twice. In 8 years before this, and both times, he had opened the session with a direct acknowledgement and explanation. This time he did not. He sat down and looked at her with a distractedness that lasted, she estimated, 4 minutes before he settled. And in those 4 minutes, she understood, without drama or self-deception, that she had moved from the center of his operational attention to a position somewhat adjacent to it. The second thing was not minor. She found on the same day a message in a set of communication records she maintained, a message from Ha-Yoon-soo to an external contact in a different city, brief and practical in its language, that used a particular phrase she recognized as a pre-agreed code from a system she had helped design 5 years earlier. A system designed for contingency protocols when organizational leadership was compromised. The phrase was being used not in a crisis, it was being used in what appeared to be coordination. Ha-Yoon-soo was not simply building a parallel structure, He was already activating it. He had partners outside Seoul. He had a timeline. She sat with both of these things together for 4 hours. Then she began to make different plans. She did not leave immediately. She left on a specific day, 3 weeks after completing the archive, because she had spent those 3 weeks doing several things in parallel. She had first updated every record she maintained to a state of completeness she had never previously bothered to achieve, because she had always been the record. She had created a physical archive. She had organized the 43 documents into a set of sealed files across 3 locations, with each location receiving only partial information and instructions pointing to the next. She had placed in each location a custodian, a person she trusted not because of organizational loyalty, but because of a longer and more personal history of observed character. She had written a letter to Ji-hoon, not of grievance, but of instruction, 8 sentences long, in the deliberate echo of a style she had once told him she admired. And then she had taken a train to a coastal city 4 hours south of Seoul, where she had rented a small apartment and unpacked 3 boxes, and spent the first morning sitting by a window, watching the sea for 2 hours, without reading anything, without tracking anything, without protecting anything. For the first time in 8 years, she was not building. She was resting. And she was waiting to see what Ji-hoon would do with the absence she had left him, because she had given him everything he needed to save himself. And what he chose to do with it was the answer to the question she had been too close for 8 years to properly ask. Ji-hoon found her letter on a Monday. He had arrived at the office space they used in the holding company building, a clean, minimal room with 2 desks and an east-facing window that delivered morning light and a long, flat band across the floor, to find that Do-hee's desk was entirely clear, not untidy. Clear. Every item removed, the desktop surface clean, in the precise way a surface is clean when it has been deliberately prepared to carry no trace of use. On the desk was the letter. He read it once. He read it twice. He put it down and looked at the empty surface for a long time. The letter told him 3 things. That she had left, something she needed him to find, and that the process of finding it was itself the point. The last sentence of the letter said, in plain characters, "You have always been better at seeing the architecture after it's gone than while it was standing, so I am making it gone. Find it." He told himself for approximately 2.5 hours that the appropriate first response was anger. And he was not a man who often found himself behind events rather than ahead of them, and the sensation of being behind was something his entire construction of self had been built to avoid. He called her phone. It went to a message that said simply that this number was no longer available for direct contact, but that if he was looking for the first step, he should speak with Madame Kwon at the antiquarian bookseller on Tongui Street, whom he would find available on weekday mornings until 11. He sat with this for another 20 minutes, and then, because there was nothing else useful to do, he went to find Madame Kwon. Madame Kwon was 67 years old, had operated her bookshop for 31 years, and had the quality of presence that certain people who have been surrounded by books for long enough acquire a dense, unhurried attention, a patience with silence that was not emptiness but depth. She looked at him when he came in without surprise. She said, "She told me you'd be here by Tuesday. You're early." He said, "I find that I don't want to waste time." Madame Kwon said, "She thought you'd say exactly that." A pause. "She said to tell you that the reason you don't want to waste time is the same reason you missed what she was doing for 8 years. Urgency and attention are not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. She put a sealed envelope on the counter. She said, "She also said to tell you one other thing before I give you this." She looked at him with the same flat, fair assessment that complete strangers sometimes manage better than the people who know you. She said, "You are not being punished. You are being educated. There is a difference, and she needs you to know it before you open that envelope, because how you hold it will determine what you see inside." He said, "How long have you known her?" Madame Wang said, 11 years, before your grandfather. Before any of this, she pushed the envelope forward. She was my bookkeeper for 3 years when she was young, and she was extraordinary. I let her go when a better situation came along, because that is what you do for someone like that. You let them go toward the thing they are capable of. He took the envelope. He did not open it in the shop. He walked 2 blocks to a small park, sat on a bench in the cold December light, and opened it. Inside were 4 photographs, 3 printed documents, and a handwritten note in Do-hee's exact small script. The note said that the photographs would be self-explanatory and that the documents would tell him where to go next. That the next person he needed to see was a man named Seo Jong-won in Busan. That Seo Jong-won had run his own separate review of what she had found from an entirely external vantage point and had reached independently the same conclusions. And that his independent verification was crucial because it meant the evidence would survive a challenge of bias. He looked at the photographs. The first photograph was a bank transfer confirmation. The second was an account structure diagram drawn in Do-hee's hand, 41 nodes, each connected by arrows indicating direction and amount. The third was a photograph of Park Hyun-soo, taken without his knowledge from a distance, at what Ji-hoon recognized as an entrance to a building in Maebo that he knew was connected to a competing network operating in a different sector of the city. The fourth photograph was a printed conversation log from a communication channel Ji-hoon himself had established, a supposedly secure internal channel showing Hyun-soo in a thread with an external handle that the document identified as belonging to a structure Ji-hoon had never heard of and that appeared to be already operational. Ji-hoon sat with the photographs for a long time. The thing he felt first was not rage. This surprised him. What he felt first was something colder and more precise, a kind of structural recognition, the same sensation he had when early in building the organization, he had looked at a territorial map of the city and understood for the first time how the pieces already related to each other before he had explicitly designed them to. What Hyun-soo had done was architectural. It was patient. It was, in the specific craft sense, good work. And that recognition, the acknowledgement of craft in betrayal, was a worse thing to feel than rage. Because rage was simple, and this was not simple. And the fact that it was not simple meant he would have to be not simple in response. He called Soya in that evening. He had not told her any of this, had not told her the specific nature of his work in terms she could have repeated in any institutional context, and this had been a deliberate structure on his part that he was now recognizing as one of many small forms of managed distance he had applied to every relationship in his life. He said he needed to go to Busan the following day. She said, "Okay." He said, "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." She said, "Then tell me when you're back. Tell me when you can sit with it properly." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." He understood this as a kindness, so plain it required no ceremony. He took the early train to Busan. Seo Jong-won was 59 years old, a retired prosecutor who had, after his retirement, built a second career as a private institutional integrity auditor, which was a formal way of describing a specific expertise in tracing the architecture of organized misappropriation. He lived in a modest apartment in the Hyundai district with a view of the beach that he never seemed to look at, according to the 3 people Ji-hoon knew who had met him. He was eating breakfast when Ji-hoon arrived, and he did not stop eating while he talked. He said, in the way of people who have given the same briefing multiple times and have stripped every unnecessary word, "I verified independently everything she documented. 41 transactions. 890 million won, final figure. The parallel structure is real and currently holds 11 agreements with external parties in 4 cities. He has been planning this for at least 2 years and 4 months, possibly longer, and the active phase you are now in began approximately 6 weeks ago." your window, for addressing this before it becomes irreversible, is probably 3 weeks, maybe 4, if he doesn't know you're moving. Does he know you're moving? Jihoon said, "Not yet." Seo said, "Then you have 3 weeks." He put down his chopsticks. "The rest of what she left you is with a woman in Daegu. That's the last stop. The Daegu file has the piece I don't have, which is the communications material that documents the external agreements. You need that to make this airtight." He looked at Jihoon with the flat, professional assessment of a man who had spent his career reading the exact distance between what people present and what people are. "She did very good work. She did it alone, and she did it correctly. I don't say that about many things." Jihoon said, "I know." Seo said, "No." A pause. "If you knew, we wouldn't be sitting here." Jihoon was quiet. Seo said, "The woman in Daegu is Kim Yoon-jae. She runs a labor mediation firm. She's been holding the material for 11 days. She's expecting you before Friday." He was on a train to Daegu within the hour. The train took 2.5 hours. He sat in a window seat and watched the countryside flatten and recomplexify in the afternoon light, the particular gray-green of Korean winter hills, and he did something he did almost never. He counted backward 8 years. He had known Do-hee for 8 years. In 8 years, she had identified 11 near-catastrophic contract failures before they became failures. She had maintained a network of 80 variable contacts across 4 cities. She had built and continuously updated an organizational memory that existed nowhere else. She had constructed the communication architecture that every operation ran through. She had, without being asked, without being structured, without being compensated at anything approaching proportion, built the thing that kept the thing standing. And he had, over the same 8 years, paid her a salary calibrated to a role that did not officially exist for a function that barely touched the surface of what she actually did, given her no title, no formal acknowledgement, no stake, no seat. He had been scrupulous about the operational relationship and had never once asked what the operational relationship had cost her as a human arrangement. He had told himself this was because the nature of the work precluded certain conventions. He understood, sitting on a train, moving through a winter landscape, that this was exactly the kind of sentence people use when they want to call a failure by a name that sounds more like inevitability than choice. He had looked at the architecture of a city and understood its structure before it was explicit to anyone else. He had not looked at the architecture of the woman who made his architecture possible. He arrived in Daegu at 4:17 in the afternoon. Kim Yoon-jae was 48 years old, precise in the way labor mediators become precise when they have spent enough years in rooms where imprecision costs people their livelihoods. She had a small, well-ordered office in the city's central district, with plants that were thriving in a way that suggested genuine care, rather than the performative greenery of offices trying to signal something. She looked at Jihoon when he arrived and said, "You have your grandfather's eyes." She mentioned that. She put a sealed folder on the desk in front of him. She said, "Before I give you that, I am going to tell you what she told me to tell you." He nodded. Yoon-jae said, she said, "The material in this folder is complete and it is sufficient. What you do with it is yours to decide. She has protected the people who needed protecting. The 23 people in your organization below the director level who had no knowledge of the extraction are documented and shielded in the evidence structure. Whatever happens to Hyun-soo happens only to Hyun-soo. She thought you would want to know that she was more careful about that than about anything else." Jihoon was quiet for a moment. He said, "She protected them first." Yoon-jae said, "She protected them first." A pause. "That's what she told me mattered most. Not the money, not him. The people who hadn't chosen it and couldn't have seen it, and would have been caught in the collapse if she hadn't built the architecture around them." He opened the folder. What was inside was the communications archive. 38 exchanges between Hyun-soo and 3 external parties across 4 cities, constituting in their totality a documented agreement to execute a leadership transition in the organization using the parallel infrastructure with a planned activation window beginning in 12 days from the date on the most recent exchange. The transition plan specified in operational language that was at once familiar and absolutely foreign, because it was his own organization's vocabulary being used against him, the progressive isolation of Ji-hoon from his own network, the redirection of key partner allegiances using financial and informational leverage Hyun-soo had accumulated over 2 years, and the positioning of Hyun-soo himself as the continuity figure, the person who had been there all along, who knew the operations, who could guarantee stability. The plan was good. It was objectively a good plan. If Ji-hoon had not been moving, if Do-hee had not moved before she left and built the countering architecture into the evidence structure, it would very likely have worked. He had 12 days. He called Soyeon from the parking structure outside Kim Yoon-jae's building. She picked up on the 3rd ring. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you all of it, and I need you to hear it without deciding what it means until I've finished." She said, "Okay." He said, "This will take a while." She said, "I have the evening." He talked for 47 minutes, standing in the parking structure as the light faded and the cold deepened and the fluorescent strips overhead cycled through their particular indifferent frequency, telling her the shape of his life as plainly as he could manage. She asked 4 questions. Each question went directly to the load-bearing point of a different part of what he had said, like someone testing the specific joint in a structure rather than pressing on the wall. When he finished, there was a silence. Then she said, "What do you need right now?" He said, "I need to find her first. Then I need to do what she built the evidence for." She said, "Then go. Call me when you found her." He was on the road within the hour. He had been searching on one level since the first morning at the bookshop, running parallel to the trail Do-hee had laid, a separate line of inquiry through the same operational channels he used for locating anyone who had chosen not to be found. His operator in this kind of work was a woman he had used for 7 years, who worked, as far as any record was concerned, as a freelance document analyst, and who had, in that role and in her actual function, a particular gift for the intersection of the personal and the geographic. She had called him on the train, back from Busan with 2 probable coastal cities. He had added the evidence from Yoonji's conversations about Do-hee's stated state of mind, the language of rest, the image of water, the specific quality of deliberate simplicity in the arrangements, and had narrowed to 1, a town on the southern coast 4 hours by road from Seoul, with a rental property registry her operator had quietly cross-referenced against travel records she was not supposed to have access to and had access to anyway. He drove through the evening. The sea appeared on his left at just past 10 at night, black and very large, and lit from below by the lights of the coastal road, in a way that made it seem both close and absolutely immeasurable. He found the apartment building at 10:43. He sat in the car for a few minutes, in the way of someone who has been moving fast toward a thing and needs a moment to arrive before arriving. He knocked. A light behind the door. A pause. The door opened. Do-hee looked at him with the flat, accurate attention that had always been her most complete expression of presence. She was wearing a plain gray sweater and carrying a cup of tea, and she looked, in a way he had not registered in years because he had stopped registering it completely herself, rested, still without the particular quality of managed containment. She wore in Seoul the organizational composure that had been so consistent he had stopped reading it as something she maintained and had started reading it as simply what she was. He said, "I found everything." She said, "I know." Kim Yoon-jae called. He said, "Can I come in?" She considered this for a moment, not performing consideration, actually sitting with the question. Then she stepped back and held the door. The apartment was small and clean and had, through a window that faced the sea, a rectangle of dark water lit in patches by the cloud-broken moon. She poured him tea. They sat at a small table. He put the folder from Yoonjae on the table between them, and he said, "I want to say something before we talk about this." She waited. He said, "I have been, for 8 years, a person who built very careful architecture around everything except the thing that made the architecture work. I did it because the correction was costly, and I convinced myself the omission was structural rather than chosen. Both of those things are true, and neither of them is adequate." He stopped. He said, "I am not asking you to forgive that right now. I am telling you that I understand it." She said nothing for a long time outside. The sea moved in its indifferent, perpetual way against the shore. Then she said, "I know you understand it. The question isn't whether you understand it. The question is what you build when you get back." He said, "What would need to be true for you to come back?" She said, "I don't know yet. I know what I don't want it to look like. I don't want to be restored to the same position with a salary adjustment and an apology. I want a different architecture, one where I exist in it at my actual function and not at the function that's easy to name." She wrapped both hands around her tea. "And I want to watch you move through what comes next and see how you do it when I'm not there doing it, because that's the part I couldn't assess from inside." He said, "You planned for both outcomes." She said, "Yes." A pause. "If you'd found the trail and used it carelessly, or not at all, or handled it in a way that protected the organization at the cost of the 23 people below Hyun-soo, I would have known the answer. If you handled it the way I designed the architecture to make possible, I would know something different." He said, "What do you know now?" She said, "I know you drove 4 hours at night to find me before you solved the problem. That tells me something." She looked at him. "It doesn't tell me everything," he said. "No," she said, "so what do we do with 12 days? He said we make it enough." They worked through the night at the small table with the sea in the window and the tea going cold, and Do-hee with a notebook she had kept current, even in rest, because some habits were structural, and Ji-hoon with a phone and the operational clarity that came from knowing exactly what the problem was and exactly what instruments were available. The architecture Do-hee had built into the evidence structure was not just documentation, it was a mechanism. It had been designed with specific institutional pathways in mind: a financial regulatory body with jurisdiction over the holding company's licensed operations, a professional arbitration board governing 3 of the external contracts Hyun-soo had compromised, and a records custodian within a legal firm that had handled the organization's legitimate corporate registrations, who held in escrow a set of governance documents that Do-hee had quietly added clauses to 18 months earlier before she knew specifically what she was preparing for, because she had felt the architecture shifting and had done what she always did, which was prepare for what she couldn't yet name. The regulatory filing alone, if submitted correctly and through the right intake channel, would freeze the external accounts in Hyun-soo's parallel structure within 48 hours of submission, making the activation timeline impossible to meet, because the parallel structure could not operate without access to its capitalization. The arbitration route would take longer, but would permanently document the compromised agreements and expose the 3 external partners, none of whom, Do-hee assessed, had the institutional tolerance for that kind of formal exposure. The governance clause she had inserted 18 months ago was the most elegant of the 3. It specified that any directorial restructuring of the holding company required 90 days' notice and a unanimous vote from 5 named governance partners, 3 of whom were currently unaffiliated with Hyun-soo's plans, and 2 of whom she had carefully assessed could be reached and fairly briefed in time to hold their positions. Not because they were loyal. because they were, as she had always understood them, rational, and a fair account of the situation would make the rational position clear. Ji-hoon spent the next 4 days on the phone. He called people he had not called in years. He called them with a directness and fairness he had not always applied in earlier dealings, because he understood that what Doe had done in building the evidence architecture was make fair dealing the only operationally viable option, and he found, in the process of doing it, that it was less costly than he had assumed and more simply decent than he had remembered decency could feel. He reached both governance partners within the first day. The first, a woman who had invested in the holding company's legitimate operations 5 years ago and who had been, in Ji-hoon's management of that relationship, occasionally dismissed in her concerns, listened to his briefing with a silence he read correctly as attentive rather than cold, and at the end said, "I'm glad someone finally laid this out plainly. I'll hold." The second partner took 2 calls and a set of the documents, delivered by a courier from the holding company's attorney, and called back on the second day with a 1-sentence answer, "I'm with you on this." The regulatory filing was submitted on the 3rd day. The freeze on the external accounts took effect 39 hours later. Hyun-soo discovered the freeze on the morning of the 5th day. Ji-hoon knew this because the operator who handled his external intelligence watched the communication patterns around Hyun-soo's network and reported a sudden burst of lateral contact, Hyun-soo reaching outward toward his external partner simultaneously, in a way that had the specific frequency of someone discovering that the ground under a structure has changed. What Hyun-soo did next was not what Ji-hoon expected. He had expected, based on his knowledge of Hyun-soo's operational style over 9 years, a retreat, a quiet withdrawal toward a defensible position, the pulling back of visible exposure while preserving what could be preserved. It was what a sensible person in Hyun-soo's situation would do. Hyun-soo did not do it. What he did instead was move toward the organization's center. He convened, on the morning of the 6th day, a meeting of the 30 members directly under his authority, calling it a standing operational review, a routine he used 6 times per year, but doing so outside the scheduled cycle by more than 6 weeks. He presented to those 30 people a version of events in which Ji-hoon had been compromised by an external relationship of a personal nature that had introduced security vulnerabilities into the organization, and in which Hyun-soo was the continuity figure, the responsible actor, the person protecting the people in the room from the consequences of leadership failure. Ji-hoon learned this at 2:17 in the afternoon of the 6th day via a member of the 30 who called him directly because she had been with the organization for 6 years and her loyalty, as Do-hee had documented, sat with the organization's actual purpose rather than with any individual leader within it. Her name was Lim Kea. She said, "He told us you're compromised. 11 people are uncertain. 9 are with him. 10 are with you. I am calling because I am not with either of you on faith. I am calling because I want to know what is actually true." Ji-hoon said, "I'm going to send you a document. Read it in full, then decide." He sent her the summary document from Seo Jung-won's independent verification. He sent it to her and to 14 others in his network, each one individually, each accompanied by a direct personal message that did not perform certainty and did not ask for loyalty, and said plainly that there was documented evidence of a financial extraction across 2 years and 4 months, that the evidence had been independently verified, that it was available to any person in the network who wanted to review it directly, and that his obligation was to be plain about what had happened rather than to manage the story of it. He then called each of the 11 uncertain people directly. He did not have scripts. He spoke plainly about what had happened and what he had done wrong and what the evidence showed and what he was asking of each person, which was not loyalty but judgment. He made no promises he could not specifically keep. 2 people told him they needed more time. He said, "Take it." 2 people told him they were with Hyun-soo. He said, "I understand." 7, over the course of 6 hours of phone calls, said they were with him. The night of the sixth day was the longest. He sat in the coastal apartment, Do-hee at the table across from him, and they moved through the operational arithmetic, the specific timeline to the arbitration proceedings, the specific freeze durations, the specific dates by which each of the external partners would need to formally withdraw from Hyun-soo's agreements or be named in the regulatory record. The ticking clock precision of it, the 48 hours here, the 72 hours there, the 90-day governance window now, with 84 days remaining, was something Ji-hoon had always been good at, but which he felt differently now, because Do-hee was doing it with him at a table, rather than in a separate space he had not bothered to picture. And the difference between those two geometries was not small. On the seventh day, the first of Hyun-soo's 3 external partners withdrew formally from the parallel agreements, citing the regulatory freeze and their own legal counsel's advice. The withdrawal documentation, filed through the arbitration board, named the original agreement and its terms, which was the public institutional footprint Do-hee had understood none of the external partners would want. On the 8th day, the second partner followed. On the 9th day, the third partner, after a silence that Ji-hoon read correctly as a specific silence of someone reviewing options and finding them fewer than expected, called Ji-hoon directly. The call lasted 9 minutes. The partner said with the controlled, stripped-down language of someone who has made a pragmatic decision without drama that the agreements were over and that he had no further involvement in whatever Hyun-soo was managing. Ji-hoon said, "Thank you for telling me directly he meant it." The partner said, "Your person built this very well." Ji-hoon said, "I know." He did not say she had done it while he was not watching, though he thought it. Hyun-soo by the 10th day was in a city he had not previously been associated with, in a hotel that his operator's network located through the specific friction of cash payments against a loyalty system that logged them anyway. He had 2 people with him. He had no operational structure. He had no external partners. He had an amount of money in personal accounts that was significant as a personal sum and meaningless as an organizational one. Ji-hoon went to the city. He went alone, which was a choice that required the kind of very specific trust he understood. For the first time in a long time was a thing that needed to be consciously chosen rather than operationally assumed. He found the hotel at 11 in the morning. He knocked on the door. There was a pause, and then Hyun-soo opened it. Hyun-soo looked at him for a moment, then he stepped back from the door. The room was ordinary in the specific way hotel rooms are ordinary when the person in them has been there long enough to stop expecting them to be otherwise. Hyun-soo sat in the chair by the window. Ji-hoon stood. Hyun-soo said, "You're going to ask me why." Ji-hoon said, "No." Hyun-soo said, "No." Ji-hoon said, "I know why. You believed you were worth more than I was making clear, and you were right, and you chose the wrong correction." He looked at him. The why doesn't help either of us. Hyun-soo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice stripped of everything except its actual register, "I built half of what exists." Ji-hoon said, "I know that." Hyun-soo said, "You never said it." Ji-hoon said, "I know that too." The silence was long. Ji-hoon said, "There is a formal process. It will proceed regardless. What I am here to tell you is that it will proceed only to the extent it needs to, and not further unless you move to harm the people who are inside it. The 23 members below your level are documented as uninvolved and will remain so." He looked at Hyun-soo directly. "That's the line. Everything below it stays where it is. Everything above it takes its course." Hwan-soo said, "And if I don't agree," Ji-hoon said, "then the same thing happens and you are in a worse position inside it." A pause. "I'm not offering a deal. I'm telling you what is true." Hyun-soo looked at him for a long time. Then he looked out the window. He said, with a flatness that was not nothing, "She built the whole thing, didn't she? The evidence, the mechanism." Ji-hoon said, "Yes." Hyun-soo said, "I underestimated her." Ji-hoon said, "Everyone did." He picked up his jacket from where he had set it on the second chair. He said, "So did I." He left the room. He did not look back. He walked down the hotel corridor and through the lobby and out into the gray winter light of a city he would not return to. And he sat in his car for a few minutes, thinking about nothing very specific, just the quiet fact of the particular day and what it had cost and what it had clarified. He called Soyeon from the car. She picked up on the first ring. He said, "It's done." She said, "Come home." He said, "I need to stop in Seoul first." She said, "I know, then come home." The formal proceedings ran their course over the following 6 weeks. The regulatory action resulted in a complete freeze and subsequent forensic audit of the parallel accounts, with findings documented and referred for additional institutional review. The arbitration board's record was sealed, as all arbitration records in that jurisdiction were by default, protecting the privacy of the uninvolved parties while documenting the conduct of the involved ones. The 23 members below Hyunsu's level were formally cleared in a communication from Ji-hoon that was direct and factual and did not perform magnanimity. 3 of the external partners who had previously withdrawn from the network services, people Ji-hoon had managed dismissively across earlier years, whose concerns he had heard and noted and filed, rather than actually responded to, contacted him in the 2 weeks after the proceedings concluded. The first of these was a woman in Busan who had worked with the organization for 4 years and who had reduced her engagement 18 months prior after a meeting with Ji-hoon in which she had raised a question about the organization's accountability structures, and he had given her an answer she had recognized as performed rather than real. She said in the email she sent that she had heard from Seo Jong-won about the way the situation had been resolved and that it had changed her assessment. She did not say she was back. She said she was watching. He wrote back, "That's the right position. I'll deserve different watching over time, or I won't. Either way, the assessment should be yours." The second and third partners made similar gestures. He responded to each with the same honest tentativeness, because the alternative performing recovered authority would have contradicted everything the last 12 days had taught him about the difference between the arrangement of trust and its actual substance. 3 weeks after the proceedings concluded, there was a gathering of the organization's full network. 47 fixed members, 61 of the 80 variable contacts, who were reachable and willing. Ji-hoon stood at the front of a room he had rented in a building in the Mapo district, the district where it had started, the district of a pharmacy and a queue of 4 people, and an old man's dignity and a $40 bill put on a counter by a woman who had not calculated. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not use notes. He told the people in the room what had happened, in terms that were honest and plain without being theatrical, and he told them what he understood about how it had been possible, which was that he had confused the management of his organization's surface with the genuine attention required to know what was actually occurring within it. He said that a person he had systematically underpaid and undernamed had, from a position of no formal authority, built the architecture that prevented a collapse he had not seen coming, and that this was not a correctable anomaly in an otherwise sound structure. It was information about the structure itself. He said, "Her name is Yoon Do-hee. She has been doing this work for 8 years. She has agreed to return to a different version of the arrangement, one that names what she does at the level at which she does it. She will be here when she is ready. I am telling you her name today because the practice of keeping the most essential thing unnamed is the practice I am ending." He said it plainly. He said it in the same room where for years her name had been the most consequential omission in every meeting. He said it once clearly in a room of the people whose daily professional lives had run on her work without knowing it. Lim Cha-ya, sitting in the second row, caught his eye. She nodded once, not warmly. Accurately, he understood the distinction. Soyeon was in the back of the room. She had not asked to be there. He had asked her. She had said, "Are you sure?" He had said, "You're the reason any of this happened. You paid $40 to a stranger, and it was the most consequential thing you didn't calculate." She had come. After the meeting, standing in the corridor outside, his grandfather's words from the pharmacy came back to him again. 8 words in the flat clarity of an old man's courtesy. "You don't know who you've just helped." He had thought the old man meant himself. He had not understood, until now, that the old man had meant Suyon. The old man had known who his grandson was, he had known what his organization ran on, and he had watched a woman pay. $40 she did not have, with a quality of unreflective attention that his grandson's entire enterprise had been sustained by, invisibly, for 8 years. He had known. He had watched her put the money on the counter, and he had looked at her with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite appraisal, and was perhaps both. And he had gone home and written a check for $4,000 and a letter about the worth of attention, because he had been trying, in the only language available to him, to begin an introduction. 2 months later, on a Saturday afternoon, Dohee arrived in Seoul. She came with 3 boxes, which was the same number with which she had left. She met Ji-hoon at the office space in the Mapo building, the same room with the 2 desks and the east-facing window and the long, flat band of winter light on the floor. There was a 3rd desk now. It was not a compromise or an adjustment. It was what the room had always needed, and what the room had been organized for 8 years to pretend it did not. She set her things down. She looked at the room. She said, "The window faces east?" He said, "Morning light." Every day. She said, "That's good." She sat down. She did not say anything for a moment. She said, "I want to be clear about what this is." He said, "Tell me." She said, "This is a trial, 6 months. Everything at its correct function and its correct name. At the end of 6 months, I will tell you what I have seen, and you will tell me what you have seen, and we will decide from there whether to continue. Not because I am uncertain about the principle, I am certain about the principle. Because trust is not an acknowledgement, it's a length of time with evidence inside it." He said, "I know." She said, "Then we'll begin." Outside, Seoul moved in its usual enormous and indifferent way. The city made no concessions to small recalibrations, to the moments in which a relationship between 2 people changed its geometry and began quietly to build something that had not existed in quite that form before. The winter light came through the east window, in the flat specific way. It always had. The room held 3 desks, and for the first time its actual number of people. "Attention," the old man had written, "has a worth that money usually fails to name. But it is nameable. It has always been nameable. The failure is never in the naming. The failure is in the decision not to try." Oh Ji-hoon, at 32, had built an architecture of $38 million and had not named the thing the architecture depended on. He would spend the rest of the time that followed learning, 1 day at a time, what it actually meant to pay attention, not to the surfaces of things, not to what could be arranged and managed and made to perform correctly, but to what was genuinely there, genuinely happening, genuinely worth seeing, not because he had found a better operational strategy, because a woman had paid $40 she did not have, and an old man had handed him, in a sealed envelope, the beginning of an education he had not known. He needed, and could not now, afford to refuse.